Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join in today. On behalf of the RCTLE College of Business Support team, we're super excited to present our guest facilitator today, Dr. Kadie Mullins. On behalf of Linda, Liz, and I, thank you so much, Dr. Mullins, for taking time to share your expertise and wisdom and knowledge, and we look forward to a really informative session with you today. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen mostly seamlessly. Everyone can see it okay? We're good. All right, now let's make sure when the time comes, we're going to play a little music today. Let's see if I actually managed to click all the right buttons. Well, thank you for hopping on. I am very excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. As Cody mentioned, I am the Executive Director for Administrative Assessment here at Riddle, which means I get the privilege of working with all of our departments to come up with a plan of what they want to work on for the year and then helping to hold them accountable to kind of delivering some results on that plan each year. I get to play in the accreditation sandbox a little bit. And I also teach our leadership ethics and corporate social responsibility courses with a worldwide campus that I love. And I am very privileged to get to do this equity work and ethics work through a lot of consulting that I do outside of Riddle. So I learn a lot from you all and then get to steal it and go give it to other folks. So I'm hoping that today we will all learn a lot from one another and really be thinking just a little bit more of a refresher and some self-reflection around decision making. Feel free, if you are comfortable, to turn your cameras on. You don't have to, but I love to see your faces. This is pretty informal. We are going to have the opportunity to do some self-reflection. Hi, Lori. And to just connect with one another as well. So before we dive in, I want to tell you what you're in for. We're going to start with some self-reflection and then also some breakout discussions on just how do we make decisions, to do some level setting and kind of getting us prepared for the conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what ethical decision making looks like, what are some strategies we can use, and then we're going to play around with some scenarios. So we'll do one big group scenario together. I'll send you back into your breakout rooms to talk about a scenario, and then I've got a special activity if we have time. We'll have to see if we have time. Does that sound good for everybody? If you don't want to turn your camera, I got head nods from the camera folks, but if you don't want to turn your camera on, the reaction buttons are super helpful for me. So if you want to give a thumbs up or even just using the chat, it's really helpful. I lost my chat, so I'm telling you to use it and I don't even see it, but that's okay. So what I want to start us with is a just quick reflection. I've got three questions on the screen, just thinking kind of in general. How do you make decisions? What is your process? Is it a gut reaction that you go with? Do you have a process that you use? Do you have pros and cons lists? What do you do? So that's going to be your first reflection question. The second is the last time that you've had to make a big decision, purchasing a house, a car, changing jobs, something really big. And then thinking about kind of smaller decisions, but something that was small that impacted others. Not what am I going to have for lunch today, but maybe something in your decision making that didn't feel really big, but you knew was going to impact others. Maybe showing up today was a small decision that you had to make, but you had to maybe cancel another meeting to do it, that sort of thing. And what we will do is I'm going to play a little music. I'm going to give you about 4 or 5 minutes to do it in your head, write it down in a Word document if you've got a notebook handy. Just give you some time to reflect on these questions, and then I'm going to send you into breakout rooms to share what you're comfortable sharing. Does that sound good for everyone? Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start our music and give you some time to think. 30 more seconds or so. One more, you can always go back if you're like in the groove. Have time later. All right, I know some of you might still be like in the groove writing, and some of you were done like 3 minutes ago, and you're sad that I made you sit there and listen to jazz music. So we're hopefully right in the middle for some of you all. When we send you out into your breakout rooms, this will give you an opportunity to continue thinking, to get ideas from other folks that maybe resonate with you. Feel free to keep taking notes and jotting things down as we move along. Your goal with this breakout room is just to kind of share your frameworks and answer these questions together. You don't all have to answer all of them. It's really just about having a conversation. And I'll give you about 7 minutes in the room. There should be 3 to 40. Actually, I'll give you 8. That way everyone's got at least 2 minutes. And I'll give you a countdown. There'll be a broadcast message when I start counting down, and then we'll make sure that you've got a heads up. Sound good? All right. All right, your rooms are open. With folks. So now that you've got a little bit of a framework and you have kind of your own processes in your mind, we're going to talk about just some basic components of decision making. Keeping in mind, to David's point, he mentioned a specific book that is wonderful that provides a very specific framework, but you can find dozens of perfectly valid decision making frameworks. You've got to find what kind of like jives with you. So what we're talking about is kind of the consolidation of all of those different frameworks, what the key points are. And so this is hopefully going to be some guidance for you. I use the phrase guidance, not gospel, right? So this is just to get you thinking. You're going to find your own church to go to when it comes to what framework you want to use. So hopefully this just gets your juices flowing. And now that you've got kind of this, what you do on your own and what you've heard from others, you can kind of compare and contrast. I like to root when we think about ethical decision making in these 3 C's, and I'd actually throw in a 4 about capacity. So thinking about our capacity today to have time to do ethical decision making in a way with a lot of structure might be a little different than tomorrow, or the situation might change the capacity. So we might have 60 seconds to make a quick decision versus having 60 days, right? So the capacity changes from time to time. But these other 3 C's I think are important when we think not just about decision making in general, but when we really think about it through this lens of ethics or equitable decision making. So it requires commitment. Sometimes the more ethical decision is going to be the one that costs a little bit more, right? Or that requires a little bit more time or a little bit more resources. So when we think about decision making, we have to think about it's a commitment to making the decision that is right for all of your stakeholders, that is right based off of your ethical framework that you set within your individual decision making, within your organization, within your team. But it is also really thinking about kind of how do we continue that and sustain that. And it requires consciousness. It's not a one and done thing. We don't make one good ethical decision and then everything just falls into place. It's something that we have to really create as an awareness in a daily practice, that we're gut checking our decisions and really thinking, well, this was a really good one. And I feel good about that decision, but now that I've done it this one way, I'm not going to keep doing, right? It's a daily practice. And then competency, just we have to continue to evaluate and assess. We all are these wonderful, like, growth beings. We can continue to do really cool things and grow in new ways. And that is the same for the way in which we make decisions and our teams as units, our organizations overall. So we want that evaluation and assessment process. Are we doing this as competently as we would like to be? So that's just kind of a little bit of level setting and understanding that good decisions are ethical, they're effective, most important, and they're equitable. So all of these align. You don't have to do one or the other. You don't have to make the effective decision over the ethical decision or vice versa. An ethical decision is really thinking about the effectiveness and all of the impacts. And that just understanding that these all intersect, and they might look a little bit different. We might use different language to describe them, but ultimately If your ethical decision is not an effective one, then it's not actually an ethical one, right? Because part of ethics is ensuring you're making a decision that is good for all of the stakeholders. And if it's not effective, then it's probably not good for some of our stakeholders. So the decision-making process has, your particular framework might have 100 steps in it. I would say that might be a lot. Most frameworks have anywhere from 5 to 15 different steps in it, but they can kind of be boiled down into these core 5. And sometimes they're going to start with 1, and sometimes we'll start with step 2, depending on the situation. So the first step is usually gathering data. Sometimes we'll gather data after an issue has come about. So maybe someone comes to you and says, here's a challenge I'm facing, or did you hear that this thing happened, or a system is no longer working. Now we've got the issue. Now we've got to go back and gather the data. So it depends on the scenario, which is going to come first, that first or the second. But gathering data is figuring out what is happening, why is it happening, how do we know what is happening, and what data points do we have or should we be collecting to really understand this issue. And identifying the issue and problem is not just saying like what the problem is, it's getting to the root of it. So I like to use the example of career services in this particular context because I think it's one that we all kind of know what career services does. I am making up data. This is not reflective of Embry-Riddle Career Services. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. So let's say career services, it's looking at all of its data, its annual report, and 90% of students have an internship by the time they graduate. Well, that's awesome. But maybe they look at it by demographic and realize that first-gen students are not getting internships at the same rate, or they're not, maybe only 20% of our first-gen students are getting internships. So now that they've identified the problem or the issue with the thing that they want to solve, they've looked at the data and said, you know what, we're not quite sure why first-gen students are not getting internships at the same rate, not participating in internships at the same rate. So now they've got to go back to that data piece and figure out why. Is it that they don't know about internships? Is it that maybe they have some other social context that we need to be considering? They've got financial burdens that are a little bit different than our general population. Maybe they are doing internships and they just don't know how to report them. Maybe they're doing internships, independently. So we've got to really go back to that data piece and get to the root. And then we want to identify our stakeholders. So in this case, our first-gen students, right? So we want to have the conversations. Who's being impacted by this issue? Our first-gen students aren't getting the same amount of internships for some reason. If we make changes to this, who might be impacted? If we're going to change our process to better serve our first-gen students, is that going to negatively impact anyone else? And then coming at it with, what biases do I bring? I'm a first-gen student. I struggled with kind of acclimating in undergrad, certainly, and figuring out what is academia. So I come at it with a bias. That's not a bad thing. It's a perspective that's helpful in this case, but it also means that I might not be seeing things as clearly as somebody who maybe hasn't been in that situation. So just kind of figuring out who are our stakeholders, what are we bringing to the table here, and who else do we need to ask, and who else do we need to consider? And then step 4 is very generic here. So apply an ethical framework. To David's point, we've got that text that's a really helpful structure. When we think about it in an ethical framework, it is going to be more rooted in your culture, in your general practices, than it is going to be applying any sort of like high-level ethics theory. Some of you might be philosophy folks. Most of us don't live in philosophy world on a day-to-day. So what is a little bit easier framework to think about is, what are our organizations or perhaps our individual values? What do we care most about? What is our mission? What are our policies? What are the rules that we live by? And then what do our stakeholders think? That's a big piece that we often forget in our decision making when we think that, well, we're going to make this decision because it's consistent with our mission. Well, how do our stakeholders feel about how that decision connects? So making sure that we're not kind of making decisions in a silo. So your ethical framework, you could Google, and 100 different ethical frameworks will come up. You might find one that resonates with you, but ultimately, as long as you're rooting it in your particular values, your mission, and your policies, so that things are consistent. And then you've got to come up with a decision. And that's the hard part often, right? It's like, okay, we've done the work. Now we've got to decide what to do. What are our next steps and implement that decision? You've got to know how it's going to be implemented. And then how are you going to decide if it was effective? Because you're going to have to repeat the process in order for it to be good decision making. You want to know, was this the right choice? Do we need to change things a little bit? And go back to kind of the process starting over. And this is just the feedback loop. It's the same thing that we expect when we're doing assessment or strategic planning, except it's usually on a little bit more of a micro level because it's around decision making. And sometimes it's a very informal, personal decisions. Your assessment might be the next day, how do I feel about this? Right? Your decision might be you're out to dinner and you're deciding if you want another drink. And the next morning you wake up and your assessment is, I have a hangover and now I'm not feeling so great. So now I know the next time I'm in that situation, I'm just going to have one drink with dinner, right? We have these big decisions that we make all the time, individual decisions, family decisions. But we also have these really small individual decisions that impact how we show up in spaces. So we can use this framework for all of those decisions that we make. You just want to figure out what kind of like feels good for you. So again, just guidance, kind of using this as a structure. Anyone have any questions about this?
Hey, Kadie, I would like to share a wonderful insight that Don shared with me during our breakout. An important part of the decision-making process is to determine, am I the right person to be making this decision? Do I have the authority or do I have the background knowledge to make an informed decision and then move forward from there?
I love that. That's wonderful. Thank you for uplifting that. And Don, thank you for sharing that in the breakout group. So somebody write that down, put that in your notes. That was very good. And maybe that falls under like your stakeholder area, right? Like maybe you're bringing other people in to say, like, this is above my pay grade. I know I've personally made that call before. Some of you might have as well. Or do we maybe have the authority to be making the decision, but ultimately we shouldn't have the authority? So that's a great perspective to add there. Any other additions to that or to this framework in general?
Yeah, one of the things we had shared in our breakout group is sometimes our decisions, no matter how big or small they are, can be coming from a place of emotion, and how it's so important to be able to separate the two when making any type of decision, because it can it can blow your life up. So I would imagine when I look at the framework here, that the steps that you've laid out, would you say that that's normally something that should be identified in step 1 or step 2?
I would usually stick that under kind of that biases bucket. That is something that we probably should be doing all of the time, but that's also a data point, right? When we're thinking about how we're collecting and analyzing our data, our emotions and our own framework of how we're looking at things is absolutely a data point. And we don't always want it to be. We would like to think that we are not making rash decisions or emotional decisions, but that very much becomes a part of how we're analyzing the situation. Don, did I see you turn your mic on as well?
Oh, I was just going to mention something briefly about the point of, am I the right person to make this decision? And the reason what I had in mind when I brought that up was that sometimes if you're leading a team and a team member says to you, what should we do? I will often, or sometimes, put the question back to them. What do you think we should do? Because they're closer to the problem. Maybe they have more subject matter expertise. So that's all.
I think that's a great point. Thank you very much for uplifting that.
Sure.
Right. Anyone else have any thoughts on this before we dive into a scenario?
This is Celeste, and we were in our group and also Kadie. And of course, being in a different country, we started to think about what are some of the decision-making strategies that we use when we're in a different country, maybe operating with a different culture. Maybe they even have a different sort of legal system, or they may have different values in terms of allocation of resources. and also how those influence their regulations and what's appropriate. And then, you know, how do we kind of incorporate and respect that, but also, well, some of us have resources from other countries as well. So it was interesting.
I think that's a great point and goes back to really thinking about the way in which we're bringing in kind of the bias or the context of the decision. So making an individual decision maybe within your family is going to be very different than making a decision within your organization, because those value structures or those policies and those laws, those procedures that guide what we're doing might be very different. So great example of being in a different country that maybe has things that are legal there and not legal here, or vice versa, and how that might shape our decisions. David, you put in the chat, 80% of real world business is emotional intelligence and 20% rational. Mike, yes, legal isn't necessarily ethical. That is very true. Depends, does that align with our values, right? So it goes back to that ethical framework and that value structure. David, did you want to expound upon your emotional intelligence part?
Yeah, hey, Dan Goleman, 1995, emotional intelligence. I'm more of a qual guy than a quant jock. I usually tap into the quant jocks to justify my qual ideas. And of course, in the hybrid world, as you know, Kadie, there's pluralism, which is a combination of qual and quant, to become somewhat balanced. But, emotional intelligence is, I know this is about decision making, which you're talking about today, which has been great so far, is all about people skills. I used to teach international MBA students at my previous employ before Embry, and used to enlighten them with, because they were usually quantitative. They were mainly from India, which is very quantitative and rational and analytical and this and that, whatever. I said, you have to scrap that for a minute, because 80% of your success in people skills in the real world is going to be emotional intelligence, qualitative. That's just what I found. But that's just my opinion. So anyway, I hope I added my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point. And I think when we think about emotional intelligence, we can expand that. And when we start thinking about equity, when we start thinking about the stakeholders and how are we bringing people into the conversation, data points doesn't just mean like qualitative or quantitative data. It doesn't just mean the numbers. It also means having a focus group with first gen students to figure out, well, what do you know about internships? And that's all those qualitative pieces. So when we think about that emotional intelligence piece, is really how do we put kind of all of those human aspects of decision making at play. Does that make sense for folks? We feel good about that? All right. Anyone else have anything from your breakouts that you would like to share? These were great. I'm always jealous that I don't get to be in all the breakout rooms. All right, we're gonna. Oh, go ahead.
I'd like to show something real quick. I was in the group with Lori and Liz, and Liz started out with something that, I still haven't figured out in my life yet. So that's why I liked her starting out with it. And that has, hey, where are we going to go eat tonight? That's a big deal. I mean, well, I like the ambiance, but I don't like the service or the food. Well, my priority is the food versus the service and the ambiance. So where's your ranking order of priorities and stuff before we can finally agree? And Italian food's too heavy, therefore I won't be able to fit my dress in the morning. It's amazing the politics that goes on just intrafamilial within your own family as to where the hell are we going to go eat tonight? Can we agree? Can we agree to disagree agreeably? I don't know. It's kind of making work out of something that's supposed to be very enjoyable. But anyway, my 2 cents.
I would love to know who has the magic formula for figuring out where the heck to go to dinner. If somebody has that, you could sell that and make millions, because I think that is like the constant question of where the heck are we going? But you used great examples of the way in which you were using data points, your framework, right? So you're thinking, what were my previous experiences here? Your data points are things like the ambience. What are What kind of food is offered? What do I have tomorrow that I have to worry about, right? So we often don't think about these parking is a great example, Liz. Maybe one of your goals is to save more money this month. Maybe you don't need to go out to dinner at all, right? Or maybe we don't need to go to the place that we really want to go. Like that's our favorite restaurant, but that's going to cost $100 more than this place, right? So all of these things come into play and it all fits into this, but we're not conscious that we're even using a framework when we're making decisions like that. So it's kind of nice to have a little structure to it, to be able to be like, well, what's most important? And ultimately it's kind of fall into that kind of number 4 step, is that what are our values? What are our priorities? What rules are we living by here? And in that kind of very common personal example is right now I'm valuing eating, right? Like I would like to not be hungry tonight, and I would also like to not cook. But what else are we thinking? Who are our stakeholders, right? Well, it's your family that's going to go to dinner. What's everyone thinking? How are we feeling about this? So maybe we're overcomplicating the little decisions, but I think it's a great example.
I just have one quick thing to add about that. I love your comment about, okay, I'm supposed to be the cooker in the family, but I don't feel like cooking. So the funny thing is that this is a great example about how our past lives influence our current decisions. And we may be bringing in issues that have nothing to do with the situation, but they're based on the framework that we are familiar with from our past. And that may not be appropriate or relevant to that group at that time.
That is a very important point, and that goes back to that bias piece, right? So I might feel very passionately about a particular topic, and I might have the data to support it, but I was looking at that data with a bias because of my lived experiences, because of where I've come from. So I made the data fit my preconceived notions, because that's what our brains do. That's totally normal. So we have to think about that. Like, well, that's why we want lots of people, particularly when it's big decisions that impact a lot of people. We don't need all the people in the world. We'd never make a decision, right? So you've got to find that happy balance. But why am I thinking this way, right? So what was I expecting to find here? And did this just affirm it? Maybe I need to look at this differently. So I think that's a great point of how kind of our past lives, things that we've done before, inform the way in which we're looking at a problem. Right. We're going to dive into a scenario that we're going to do together, and then I'm going to give you a little time in your breakout rooms to tackle another scenario and kind of just work through this process. Before we do that, when we think about ethical decision making, it shouldn't happen in a silo. So whether it's within your family unit, whether it's within your department, your organization, we make better, more ethical decisions when it becomes a habit. And when it becomes a habit, we create a culture. So when we think about developing a culture, it's not just left up to Dr. Butler to design our culture, right? Like he might lead a lot of those initiatives. He might model a lot of that, but we have a lot of influence in our levels, regardless of where we are at, to inform and kind of guide the culture. So thinking about a culture of ethics just means that we're consistently saying we do what we say we do, that we're living by these values and this mission and these policies that we've created, that those should be rooted in equity. When we talk about equity, it's really just human dignity, right? How do we make sure all of the people in this puzzle are being respected? That there's ownership in that decision making, right? That people feel a part of building that culture of making these decisions, of upholding these decisions. And when we do that, when we model that as leaders, when we model that as team members, we start to create trust. We can be transparent, and maybe when we get to that implementation part and we realize maybe it wasn't the best decision, and now we're looking at the data, we can say, you know what, we thought we were making a good decision, it wasn't the best one, here's how we're going to tweak it a little bit, and having that transparency, and in that being able to be transparent, being vulnerable and authentic, that it's a vicious cycle of goodness when we just create this culture around expecting us all to make ethical decisions and behave in a way that is ethical. So it goes back to kind of that conscious piece. Like it's not, we're making this one big decision and now we've put a lot of work into making this particular decision ethical or equitable, and now everything's going to fall into place. It's something that we have to really focus on building the culture around. Now we'll do the scenario. So some of you might have been in this situation. You're teaching a course in the middle of a pandemic. You know, many of your students are balancing drastic work changes with added caregiving responsibilities, perhaps children at home doing virtual schooling or homeschooling, aging parents who maybe needed, you know, home health care, and now you're not allowed to have those folks in the home. You find that 87% of students have earned a C or below on a midterm exam, and 9 out of 10 students have submitted an assignment after the deadline. You typically adhere to a very strict late policy, which are read and agreed upon at the beginning of the start of the term. You have a decision to make. How are you going to handle this decision? So what are you going to do? What questions might you ask yourself, and how will that inform future decisions? I want to hear from y'all. What do you think? Some of you might be able to pull from personal experience on this one.
Well, Kadie, for me, it's all about flexibility. Those, particularly what we went through last year, are very unusual circumstances, and some individuals had more resources available than others. So I think it's very important to remain flexible. So long as the student is making the effort, then we should meet them halfway.
David, were you going to share something? I don't want to speak over you.
No, I agree with I missed the lady's name that just contributed. I agree with her 100% with what she said. I mean, my late policy is no lates. Well, that sounds good on paper, but boy, that doesn't fly. You gotta be flexible. You gotta be open. You gotta be accessible, convenient. You have to be willing to pivot and shift to the situation at hand. But many of my colleagues said, Dave, how could you have a late policy stated there on your bio page of just no lates? Okay, I mean, you're going to get killed on the evals. I have the highest evals in the school. So it does work, but what you can have it on paper, but in the real world, I have to reach out to students, you know, on the dashboard, and also, you know, email and text, this, that, whatever. And you have to make exceptions to the rule as you go, even though it says no lates, you know, because, you know, but I will say this, though, even though we try to be flexible and do what's right for the students and student success and all those kind of things, if you give them an inch, they're going to go a mile. I hate to say it, you know, if you do it once, they do it twice, 3 times. This is getting tiring already. Why don't we even have a policy, no lates? You know what I mean? So you end up working extra hard and stuff. So, and then one other thing I like to add, you know, is you can be flexible and stuff. But one thing I do around week 7 of the 9-week term, I do a 3 in the last third of the term. I start already the warnings, kind warnings of, you know, the fat lady sings at midnight on Sunday, end of week 9. In other words, there's no exceptions. I don't do incompletes. And as nice as I've been up till now, there's no nice at 12:01 on Monday. And that comes as a shocker to many. And that's even warning them 3 weeks in advance every week, week 7, 8, 9. I put the expectation out. I'm a nice guy, but, you know, I ran out of apples, you know, that kind of thing.
You know, it's interesting because I kind of have the exact opposite policy with my students. I have no late policy. As long as your crap is turned in by the end of my priority, you have to participate in discussions, because otherwise no one's going to talk to each other. But I will tell you, because I've set those expectations, I would say maybe 1 student, 2 students are late more than once on an assignment. So it's interesting. What I'm hearing is you're communicating clear expectations and then being willing to compromise a little bit. So you've got your value structure. Someone else turned their mic on. Mike, did you have something?
Yeah, I just say your primary question was about the pandemic. I don't disagree with David because I've been there as well. But the pandemic, I think we had to carve a whole new path concerning whether it's late or exceptions for attendance or what have you. I'm teaching my first worldwide class, and I, like David, have a no late policy. I mean, sorry, you know, you have a week to get work done. On the other hand, I haven't had a problem with students coming to me saying, oh, gee whiz, I ran into this, that, or the other problem. And I realized that with worldwide, typically, my understanding is, I'm dealing with a slightly different population than when I was dealing with at Daytona Beach. So, but I probably, like Heidi and David, will make exceptions. If the student gives me a reasonable explanation as to, they had a storm and, the power was knocked out and the internet and I couldn't, well, geez, that's beyond the student's control. On the other hand, we are preparing these students for, the real world. And, you can't go to your boss and say, oh, geez, dude, I just didn't get it done. I mean, that doesn't cut it. And so therefore, to David's point, there are no more apples at a certain point.
Bettina, I would love to hear your thoughts. I see your mic on.
Yeah, so I absolutely, I agree with what everybody's saying, really, I mean, because you have to find that balance with the students. And I think in this particular situation, with the pandemic over this last year, for those certain scenarios that warranted, an extension again, which is not straight across the board. I'm similar to David. I've got a, pretty much no late policy. And if they do, I've got point deductions along the way. But I try to take a step back and say, okay, what is my role as their teacher right now? What should they gain, knowledge-wise by the end of the course? And I would much rather if a student had, again, extenuating circumstances, power outage, and it didn't come back on until the day before the assignment was due, I would rather them take the time to put the effort in the assignment so that they can get out of it what they were intended to do, what we needed them to get out of it, than rush and just do something bare minimum just to get the check in the box. I would rather them just take an extra day or two if that's what you need, because I think a lot of students do that. And again, the pandemic was challenging for everybody across the board. So I think that most of us, I think we're more lenient. And I always think that I'm representing the university. So heaven forbid I say no to a student and then they email Dr. Butler and say, Dr. Marisik said I could not, and I had no power or, some crazy extenuating circumstance. So even though sometimes I'm kind of like, suck it up, like, you're going to be in the industry, you've got deadlines that you have to meet. I think that they're still students. So I try to give them a little bit of leeway there.
Hey, Katie, if I may add a brief comment to take it from a different perspective. So COVID aside, because we know that's unusual, but looking at your graph, 9 out of 10 submitted an assignment after the deadline. I think that's an opportunity for the instructor to look at their curriculum. Am I imposing too high a workload with the students, have jobs, have other classes? Is the workload in that course appropriate for the learning outcomes? And I take very seriously our evaluations, feedback that we get from students. And I have revamped my courses every single time I teach them, because it's not whiny students, oh, this is too hard. It's a student saying, I don't have the time for this level of detail, or, can we get the learning outcomes achieved with 3 discussions as opposed to 1 every week? So I think it's also an opportunity not to only just look at what's going on with the students' extenuating circumstances, but self-reflect on the design of the course. Where can I make improvements to reduce the workload?
It's like I planted you. I promise I didn't, but I see that Cody and Don, you both have your mics on as well. So I want you all to be able to share, but I think you just like that. I was going to start doing my nudge. That's where I wanted you all to get. So that's perfect. Who would like to go first? Cody, Don?
I just had a quick question. I'm loving this dialogue and the conversation that's happening. It's really insightful for me. I don't currently teach, and so it's really insightful to hear the perspective, but I'm curious, 2 questions. If you find yourself making your decision makings in terms of how you address requests from students, if you found it different, your decision making process to be different during the pandemic, and not only from the pandemic, but term to term, if you if you find yourself doing your method the same way, or if you find yourself adjusting to kind of the tone of the course. I'm just curious the decision-making process in that regard.
Bettina, did you want to respond to that?
That's a great question, Cody. And from my personal experience, I do have to adjust sometimes based on student needs. You'll have some students that are just, rock stars at certain things. Everyone gets it. We're moving along. Where I'll have other terms where it's the same course and students are just struggling. They're just not getting it. I'm finding I'm having to do a lot more feedback or whatever the case is. So for me, that's almost a leadership type of, adjusting my teaching style based on what the student needs are.
Thank you. And then Dawn, I would love your comment, and then we're going to head into our next breakout.
Okay, and just for starters, what Bettina and Cody and the others are saying totally resonates. I was just going to comment. I was going to sidestep the question, but just comment on the question, which is that for me, I think this kind of gets to the heart of why an approach based on equity is challenging, because it's much easier to administer a situation where everyone has the same rule. And more difficult to start trying to think about equity and to recognize that some people have a different starting point than others. I know that in the case of the pandemic, there have been times, the pandemic was sort of unique, but there have been times in the past where I've said, okay, this phenomenon affects enough of my students that rather than try to work on an exception basis, recognizing that some students may be shyer than others or whatever, to say, okay, because of the of how widespread this thing is, I'm going to operate on trust and make a more liberal rule, knowing that some people will probably take advantage of it, but achieving that kind of flexibility in terms of whatever it is, a due date or something like that. So that's all.
Absolutely. I think that that's a wonderful point. And as we think about equity, right, that is different than equality. So having this exact same set of rules that everybody has to play by, this is going to be exactly the same thing. There's no exceptions. That's equality, right? But when we talk about equity, it's understanding, for example, you have 4 children. They all need $100 to do something. One of them has saved $90 and one of them has saved $40. You don't need to give the same amount of money to the person who has saved $90. Now, your value structure might say they did more work and they've saved more money, therefore I want to reward them. But is it because maybe that's the older kid and they've been able to get different kinds of, better paying jobs, right? So they can do odd jobs for the neighbor versus the 7-year-old who's probably not going to be mowing the neighbor's lawn. Right? So when we think about equity, it is this very complex human issue that there's no one right answer for, which makes it really frustrating because we just want easy answers, right? We just want to know. But thinking about that flexibility and how do we honor the student experience in this case, or our colleagues' experience, or the decisions we're making individually. So I appreciate that you all have kind of had this initial reaction of this is how we're going to respond. In the pandemic, we're going to be more flexible, right? So that was your capacity decision. I have to make a decision right now. One of my students was an ER nurse in the middle. Like, I can't expect this poor man who's now working 90 hours a week in the middle of New York City at the height of the pandemic to suddenly be meeting deadlines, right? But he was already halfway through the course. So how could I work with him? Different expectations for him than for other students. So that's kind of the capacity question. But then thinking long-term, what's the root cause of the problem here? Was it just the pandemic, or is there something that I can change in the course or different expectations we can have? So it goes all kind of into that. We only have 5 minutes left and I want you all to get to talk to each other again. So what I'm going to do, these are 2 other scenarios. You can pick one to do in your group. You can come up with a different scenario. You can keep talking. I'm not going to check what you're talking about, but I am going to close the breakout rooms at 3 and pull you back in because I don't want to take up extra time. But these are both scenarios right from Riddle that I think we have kind of addressed. But the first is looking at underprepared students in upper level courses. So you're teaching those upper level courses, and you've noticed that over the last few years, those students are less and less prepared. So you do a little of that data gathering and find that the introductory courses are no longer teaching the same things that they were when you last kind of aligned the curriculum, and you notice that some instructors are covering more content than others. So what can you do in that situation? What are your decisions that you have to make there? And then research authorship. A colleague has implemented an assignment in a course that requires students to complete a scholarly article appropriate for submission for publication. And you've noticed that that colleague is submitting the best papers with listing themselves as first author and the student as co-author rather than the appropriate way. So what do you do in these situations? So I'm going to send you back out into your rooms. I'm going to give you an extra minute. Is that okay with everyone? I'll pull you back at 3:01. And so I'm going to send you now so you can start talking.
Yeah, thank you. I know, Dawn, we got cut off because Kadie is a taskmaster, but yes, I'm definitely gonna put that on my radar to watch. He was sharing with me that they saw In the Heights, which is the new film that came out about the Latinx, whatever the correct political term is, experience. So being Latina myself, I definitely will check it out.
Very good. Well, thank you all for staying a couple of extra minutes. My contact info, I just had to double check. I couldn't remember if I put my contact info on the screen. It is there if you want to reach out and chat, but I really encourage y'all, like, make a note of each other's names. Everyone is relatively easy to find on Teams or in Outlook, and continue these conversations. This was really intended just to kind of start a framework and continue the conversation, because none of this happens in a silo. It's something that we have to continue to work on. And I just really appreciate getting the opportunity to learn from you all and engage in conversation today. So I thank you, and I will give you all the rest of your afternoon back. Happy Wednesday. Hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.